Mr. Speaker, the Progress Singapore Party will not support this budget because of the GST hike. Middle-class Singaporeans will have to bear an additional GST burden of $1.2 billion per year. On top of that, many Singaporeans living in private properties who are asset-rich but cash-strapped will bear a significant part of the $380 million property tax increase per year. This budget is a feeble attempt to increase the taxes on the rich after 3 decades of favorable tax policy towards them. The additional personal income tax raised is only $170 million per year, which many Singaporeans cynically pointed out was not enough to pay for the $180 million per year funding for SPH Media Trust. And the additional registration fee increase for luxury cars is not really a burden to the rich because the fee is transferable to future owners. Not enough has been done on foreign manpower policy too. The increase in the minimum qualifying salary for employment pass holders is too little to be effective. I'm also surprised that S-Pass holders are needed in the finance industry where many Singaporeans are hoping to work. The more effective way to manage the quality of our EP holders is to ensure fair competition between the EPs and Singaporeans through imposing a standard wage levy on all EPs who do not make CPF contributions. If we impose a monthly $1,200 EP levy, as I recommended in the budget debate last year, and then again in the foreign talent and SECA debate, the levy will raise almost $3 billion and make the GST hike unnecessary. As global inflation is on an upcycle, we have to do more to help Singaporeans cope with the rising cost of living and asset inflation. This is the best timing to share with Singaporeans a small part of the huge windfall profits chalked up by GIC, MAS, and Temasek last year. However, not only the government didn't do that, it increases the tax burden on Singaporeans. This is incomprehensible to me. The government used healthcare cost as the main rationale for raising taxes. However, Singaporeans have paid and are still paying dearly for healthcare. Is it fair to ask them to pay more taxes for healthcare again, especially in these challenging times? Look at the facts. $100 billion of the Singaporeans' CPF funds are locked up in MediSave accounts, and Singaporeans contribute $10 billion to MediSave every year. $10 billion of reserves have been accumulated in MediShield and CareShield, while Singaporeans continue to pay $3 billion of CareShield and CareShield premiums every year. And the premiums are likely to rise every 5 years. Singaporeans also pay billions of dollars in private healthcare insurance. Singapore is actually in a very strong financial position. We have the resources to pay for even the large healthcare cost increases forecasted by the government. Look at the facts again. The government reported $1.4 trillion of financial assets as of 31st March 2021. This is an indication of the size of our national reserves. Our nation's financial assets are currently closer to $1.6 trillion due to an increase of $200 billion of reserves over the last 2 years, despite and after the COVID-19 drawdowns. Net investment income from these assets is now more than $40 billion a year. Half of the net investment return, or $20 billion, is recycled back into the reserves. Another $10 billion of annual land sales proceeds is put into the reserves directly and not used for the current year spending. Thus, even without touching the growing reserves, we have a total of $30 billion of unutilized revenues annually, which can be deployed for the current year spending in the future. We can actually provide for our current generation while continuing to save for future generations at the same time. Hence, the government's argument for the future generation does not hold water. The virtue of frugality preached by the finance minister is telling cash-strapped Singaporeans to tighten their belts again, while the government is sitting on massive reserves and unutilized revenues. Of course, we cannot rest on our laurels and rely on our reserves and unused revenues all the time. I only want to stress that we have the buffer and time to make better long-term plans. Those plans should include the government focusing on fiscal efficiency and discipline. While the government has been running budget surpluses these years, public spending cuts have not been discussed openly. Our budget has increased by about 7% per year over the last 2 decades to about $100 billion for financial year 2022. There is thus ample room for us to cut down on existing spending. The finance minister has disclosed he's imposing a 3% cut on existing expenditures from next year. If he can achieve that every year, we will have a saving of $3 billion per year. Again, there is no need for the GST hike. And we can probably do more cut than 3%. We advocate setting clear social economic targets for each expenditure. That is the reason we supported the Singa scheme, which will bring big infrastructural projects under stricter financial discipline. For example, many Singaporeans are asking, what are the social economic return targets for SPH Media Trust, to which the government is committing $900 million over the next 5 years? How about the billions of dollars of taxpayers' money spent on local universities that have relied heavily on foreign talent, but do not seem to be producing sufficient local skills and talent needed for our economy? When public funds are used to support or rescue a commercial organization, are there plans to claw back the funds when the commercial organization starts to make money? For the COVID spending, many Singaporeans have questioned why the $30 billion job support scheme is used to support profitable companies without a clawback feature. The clawback funds could have been used to help many more Singaporeans who needed help. So as the amount of resources at the disposal of the government grow larger, we need to check on the expenditures more closely. We are also against the goodie bag approach as adopted by the government to convince Singaporeans to accept the GST hike. Handing out short-term ad hoc goodies to Singaporeans instead of using permanent schemes will not produce resilient Singaporeans, but dependent Singaporeans. Let me give you a specific example. I'll be recommending a minimum living wage of $1,800 per month in take-home pay for all Singaporean workers. This works out to about $2,250 in gross wage per month. This may appear high, but if you add workfare supplement, GST voucher, USAVE rebate, CDC voucher, and now progressive wage credit, you could easily reach the $2,250 gross wage per month. Hence, instead of handing out drips and drabs to Singaporeans, the government could have provided a lump sum to top up the average worker's gross wage to $2,250 per month. A permanent monthly wage of $2,250 will give workers more clarity in making personal financial plans for himself and for his family. That is how we make Singaporeans more resilient. Mr. Speaker, in conclusion, 1. The Progress Singapore Party does not support this budget because there is no need for the GST hike. 2. Our country is in a very strong financial position, but Singaporeans need all the help they can get to overcome their current financial challenges. 3. With this budget, the government is asking Singaporeans to tighten their belts again while it sits on massive reserves and unutilized revenues. 4. As Singaporeans are already burdened with high healthcare costs, the government should first control the escalating cost of healthcare by changing the way our healthcare system works. And finally, PSP thinks that Singapore can have a new financial compact, which is better than this budget. Speaker, Chinese, please. 前进党反对增加消费税，所以不支持这项预算案。政府通过增加消费税，将给中产阶级国人每年增加12亿元的负担，而同时，政府对富人的所得税和财富税的税收每年却仅增加预计不到6亿元。新加坡财政状况良好， 当国人仍在面对各种困境的时候，我们应该花心思制定更好的财政方案，帮助他们。我们至今有16000亿储备金和300亿还没被动用的年收入。政府坐拥着金山银山，为什么还要在这个时刻让新加坡人勒紧裤腰带呢？新加坡人已经在当前和未来的医疗需要上付出了大笔经销，所以我们重点应该首先放在减少不断上升的医疗保健成本，而不是在加重新加坡人的负担。政府的财政支出在过去20年里，以每年7%的幅度迅速增长，是时候看看该如何减少非社会性和非医疗性的开支。其中，政府的1000亿元的新冠疫情解救方案，其中的花销需要好好核算，给人民一个交代。前进党寻求一个替代方案，以新的财政模式更公平地分配国家资源，惠及社会各阶层。谢谢。Singaporeans deserve better. Thank you.
Professor Kolianpin. Sorry, Mr. Saktiandi Supat.
Mr. Speaker, you allow me permission to seek clarification from Mr. Leong Man Wai.
Please do.
Mr. Leong Man Wai, you mentioned that the GST hike will result in $1.2 billion in tax burden on middle-class Singaporeans in the long run. Can you share with us how you got that 1.2 billion figure, as I don't seem to be able to find it in published material? Thank you, Mr. Leong.
Thank you, Member Satyandi, for the question. Speaker, I got the data by calculating from the ratio given by the Minister of Finance in terms of the share of the GST paid by the top 20% and the bottom 80%. It was in the ratio of 60 to 40%. Okay, so 40% to the bottom 80% and 60% to the top 20%. So if the total amount of GST revenue to be raised from a 2% increase in GST, that would be about $3 billion. So 40% of $3 billion, I got my $1.2 billion. That's how I got my $1.2 billion, yes.
That's a second additional clarification, please. Mr. Leong, can I ask you whether you can confirm that your calculations do not take into account the amounts that middle-income residents or Singaporeans will receive under the assurance package and the permanent GSTV scheme? Just want to confirm that your calculations do not include those.
Speaker, yes, the calculation don't take into consideration that, but I presume that the GST vouchers and all the compensation payment will only apply to the lower income Singaporeans. There are some applying to the middle income, but the permanent GST voucher, all that belongs to only the lower income. So at the end of the day, when the government argues that this is not regressive, it is not true. Because apart from the top 20%, who are the people who will bear the remaining 40% of the GST increase? Must be the middle-class Singaporeans. I hope that answers your question. Thank you.
Thanks, Mr. Leong. I just asked, the reason why I asked is I just want to have an understanding, because the way I interpret the budget booklet and the statement that Minister Lawrence highlighted is that the assurance package and the permanent GSTV in some ways neutralize the impact on the majority, including the middle income as well.